My Mother, The Person and the Patient is an original podcast written and hosted by me, Fortuna Kuso. This podcast is about my mother, Timira Abdussamad Mohammed, Ayaya we call her, and that's the Somali word for grandmother, and her great-grandchildren call her Ayaya too, and that is their way of saying great-grandmother. As I had explained in previous episodes, when my mother was diagnosed 2011, we as a family were given this diagnosis. We were told this is what your mother has. This is a prescription to hopefully slow down the disease. This disease is going to get worse. And we were given a list of all the things that could happen. But we were not given any place to go for resources, how to get help. What are some of the strategies to deal with the progression of the disease? I would notice new symptoms on my mother, and then I would go to her family doctor. I would say, okay, she's not sleeping. She's wandering the entire night around the house, waking everybody up. He would say, here is the prescription to help her sleep, and off you go. I notice severe side effects of that medication that was supposed to help her sleep. And he would say, okay, what do you want me to do? You want to take her off this medication? Yes. Okay, this is how you do it. Gradually taking her off. And then she's leaving the house in the middle of the night when we're asleep and nobody to help you with that. So we go to the specialist twice a year, and the specialist would ask me, what are the new symptoms you notice? Where is the progression of her disease? And then I would tell him things I noticed, and he would make changes to the prescription. And he would say, okay, if you want a refill or anything like that, reach out to your family doctor. And that was it. So any strategies that I employ today, I had to learn in trial and error, doing this and not working, and then doing that. How would I sleep through the night without giving my mother medication to make her sleep? How could I make sure my mother didn't leave the house in the middle of the night while at the same time I'm getting good night's sleep? What are some of the foods that my mother is eating? How do I strategize? How do I get support from the long-term care of the healthcare system? And how much of that support am I eligible for? How do I find somebody that I could hire so they could stay with my mother while I am away at work during the day, so I can earn income to take care of both of us? How do I stop my mother from continuously falling? And when she fell, how do I get her up from the floor and back on the chair? When she stopped being mobile, how do I move my mother from the bed to the wheelchair, from the wheelchair back to the bed, from the bed to the shower? How do I do that? How do I select most cost-effective lift that is the safest for my mother? How do I select, evaluate, and purchase a wheelchair that is cost-effective for my mother and at the same time safe for her? Are there any government grants through the healthcare system that would allow me to pay or partly pay this wheelchair, this lift, the hospital bed? I had to learn every step of the way and teach myself. And that in mind, I noticed when it came to my daughter, from the time she went missing to this day, it's hard as a family to get through this without getting any information. How do we separate the information we get from community, those people that are not involved with the investigation, and the lack of information coming from the police and those involved with the investigation? How do we understand what's true and what's not? Because when my daughter was missing, the week she was missing, 4 days before the police gave us the final notice that she was gone, we were getting information from the community saying that your daughter's body had been found. This is what happened to her. That's what happened to her. And anytime I call the police and I say, this is what I hear. Somebody called me and told me this. And I would ask them, have you found my daughter? They would say, no, we have not found your daughter. Do you know where she might be, who she might be with, who she had been with last? And they would say, we cannot tell you that. Those were the two answers that I was getting every time I asked that question. Just like the doctors with my mother's situation that were telling me, okay, she's not sleeping, here's medication. You have severe side effects, you can take her off. Nothing more, nothing less. It was the same thing with the police. We have not found your daughter. We cannot tell you that. That's what I was getting. Even after she had been found, after we had the funeral, people calling me and giving me some evidence. I do not know how they have that when we don't have anything as a family. These people were telling me all this information, and the police were not verifying or rejecting these claims. They only had these two answers for me. No, we have not found your daughter. No, we cannot tell you that. Dealing with this situation, dealing with this loss of my daughter, dealing with this tragedy reminds me, when you face obstacles, whether it's my mother's situation, living with Alzheimer's, and me trying to get resources for her as her caregiver, and my daughter's loss, and us trying to understand as a family what really happened to our child, what had taken place those days she was missing, and getting all this misinformation and not hearing anything from those that have information on her through the investigation showed me that when a family faces difficult time, all you have is those that care about you. And you have to find your own way of getting yourself to a peaceful place, whether it's helping my mother have some dignity as she lives with Alzheimer's, and allowing my family to find some kind of a peace. Even if we do not have the answers we desire, the answers that would have given us some kind of peace of mind, we have to find peace and comfort in this loss, in this tragedy, just like we found the peace in my mother's struggles living with Alzheimer's. And that has made all the difference. When you listen to how we arrived at my mother's diagnosis and what followed, it's so easy to see her just as the patient, to see her as nothing more than the disease that reduced her to shell of her old self. But I want also to tell you about my mother, the person, the fierce woman that told her stories unapologetically, celebrating the beautiful parts and harsh realities equally. I want to share with you the stories she told us about her life as a girl growing up in a small village, the tales that marked her adulthood. I want to share with you all her losses and the ultimate winnings. The following chapter is one of those stories reconstructed from my childhood memory. Two days after her daughter's angry letter, Timira wrote her response with Farah's help. She knew Amina had said she wouldn't write again. Still, Timira waited for a note, a word, a letter. She went to the market several times each week following the day she'd sent that letter with the bus driver. She'd asked him to drop it off at the fish market where the family shopped. Timiro sat on a bench only a few yards from where the bus stopped. In waiting, she grew restless. It was challenging to stay in a seating position long enough. After only a few minutes, dread would fill her entire being, pushing her off the seat and propelling her forward. She'd pace the space between the bench and the bus stop until the bus reached a creaking halt. Her eyes always landed on the driver, surveying his hands. The parcels and the letters were going into one or another of the awaiting hands, even though she could see how he passed her, handing something to someone behind her, next to her, or in front of her. He had nothing for her. His gaze never met her searching eyes. She remained standing there until he pushed his empty hands into his pockets. Even long moments after the driver had locked the bus and walked toward his home, Timiro would keep her seat on the bench, waiting for an answer she knew wasn't coming. She sent several more letters after the first one, but received nothing back. I don't see the reason for another letter, Farah said. Maybe the family moved and is not getting your letters. I want to write it anyway, Timiro said. She knew the silence had nothing to do with the move Amina had mentioned in her last letter. Hassan's family was well known in the city. The fish market where she'd addressed her message belonged to a man of the same tribe as Hassan and his family. That meant if the family moved, which Timira had doubted they would leave their homestead and tribe, any letters coming for them would easily be forwarded. It was evident from the first week of her vigil at the market. Her daughter intended to keep her vow of silence. But Timira didn't say that to her brother. No point in inflicting the same pain of rejection she'd endured on him. She deserved to suffer knowing her daughter wanted nothing to do with her, for she paved that road herself. But her brother didn't need to feel it. I want to try one more time. Farah opened the notebook and wrote as the words, often sad and sometimes pleading, poured out of her. Like always, the silence that followed that last dispatch howled around Timiro, highlighting the need to decide her next step, even though she had no idea what that is. I have to go. The decision struck her at that very second that she said it. The words leaving her lips sounded foreign. She'd no thought, no plan to say anything of the sort before she spoke the words into existence. The ground beneath her feet shook as her lips parted and her tongue moved inside her mouth without any plan. Her statement came to life. Twins and Farah were asleep. The chill of the evening air pulsed between her and her father and stepmother. The fire in the hearth lit after the evening prayer dwindled into large embers covered by layers of ash. The darkness of the mature night enveloped them. Only her parents' silhouette was visible across from her. Even though she couldn't see him fully, she saw her father flinch. His right arm jerked backward before he leaned forward. Timiro felt his searing gaze land on her even through the dark barrier. The sensation sent shivers all over her body. But there was no going back, even though Timiro wished she could swallow it, as much as it pained her to see her father's reaction. This had no takebacks, no changing the course of action such a statement unleashed. Go where? Faduma, her stepmother, spoke in a slow, halting tone, almost a whisper, as if she didn't want to say anything. The question had forced its way out of her mouth without her consent. You took no husband, so where will you go? I don't know. That was the truth. It changed nothing about her situation. She was a 28-year-old woman, still sleeping in her childhood bed. She had no children and no prospect of a husband. The rest was automatic. Once the glimmer to reconnect with her children died, she'd leave the only home she'd ever known, mainly because she felt as if she didn't deserve the comfort home provided. We can't send you out there alone with no protection. Fatima turned to Timira's father and waited for him to say something. Could we? There is nothing here for me. Timira rushed in before her father spoke. She didn't want him to try and stop her. You know that. She looked from her father to stepmother and back again. How about us, your family? Fatima, who'd never said a harsh word to Timiro, spoke much louder than the space demanded. We are your family. It bothered Timiro she'd offended her stepmother. I didn't mean it like that. She stopped for a second, hoping Fatima would say something. She didn't, and the silence forced Timiro to continue. I am a grown woman with no home, children, or husband, she said. She is right. Timiro's father surprised both her and her stepmother. She's right? Her stepmother sounded incredulous. Timiro was too stunned to speak, so she turned to her father at once and waited along with her stepmother. Her father remained quiet for a long time. A total silence settled over the room, only interrupted by the chirping crickets and the hyena's crackle coming from afar. You have a cousin in Hudur. Her father was speaking to her now. He was so calm, as if he had thought about this day for a long time, planned for its inevitable arrival someday. I will send her a word. One early morning, a week after that night, Timiro gathered her belongings and left her parents' home. Timira's cousin, Dahaba, was married to a police constable deeply connected to Hudur and its people. He wasn't a wealthy man, with no land to call his, no cattle to let graze, and no business to run. But he made up for what he lacked in his pocketbook with his big personality and welcoming smile. Dahaba and her husband insisted that Timira live with them. The implication that she stay with them until she was married wasn't lost on her. Her parents must have impressed upon them to guide her that way, and she didn't mind. Of course she didn't. 30 years into their marriage, their 3 children were grown and out of the house, a point that didn't seem to factor into their relationship. They joked and smiled, neither taking to heart anything that was said or done. Noor and Dahaba looked at one another as if this was the first time they laid eyes on each other. When one saw the other, their faces lit up into the brightest smile Timira had ever seen. Eyes big with longing were unlike all the other couples she'd seen, save her parents. Even there, the similarity wasn't linear. Timira's mother was wild according to her father's family and the people in her village, and her father never tried to tame her as the villagers expected him. But Timira suspected if her mother hadn't left when she did, her parents might have grown into her cousin and her husband's station, equally happy after decades of marriage. Their personalities fit snugly like the garbsar that sat around Dahaba's head tightly. Timira had seen it with her parents. Now, such a bliss was a full view before her. Timira longed for something like it, a husband to connect with the way Dahaba and her husband did, the way her parents had before her mother's untimely departure. But it was then that reality set. Even if such a possibility existed, her cursed life might not be part of it. Not only did Dahaba and Noor delight in each other's company, but they had a countless friends who seemed to bask in their presence. Their two-room house was always clean, orderly, and ready to welcome the next group of guests. And the gathering of friends was a weekly ritual. The first night Timiro saw this gathering of equals was her third day there. Their guests, 9 couples and 3 single men, came only a few minutes after Maghrib prayer. "You have a visitor," one of the men asked when the Habba closed the door behind them. He appeared younger than the other men around him. He was one of the 3 men that came without a woman. Was he single, or did he leave her home? The thought came to Timiro as soon as she saw him watching her. She averted her gaze because she wasn't interested in exchanging glances with a man. "This is my cousin Timiro." The Habba smiled in her direction. "She's here to try the city life." She winked at her. "What's going on?" Timiro took the Habba by the hand and pulled her to the kitchen as soon as the men moved to greet another couple that had just arrived. "Why are all these people here?" The sight of the crowd forming in her cousin's common room alarmed her. In her village, people came together for special occasions, wedding ceremonies, childbirth, or funeral services. Did someone die? That was the only way Timiro could understand this sudden influx of people. The Habba had said nothing about people coming all that day as Timiro helped her clean the house and cook. "It's just a little get-together." The Habba considered Timiro for a second or two. "For what? Must there be a reason?" Her cousin asked and waited, perhaps for her to say something. When she didn't, the Habba continued. "You don't have to take part if you don't want to, but it would be very nice if you joined us to meet our friends." Timiro didn't know what she wanted or deserved, but she knew these people existed on a planet far different from hers, carefree, unlike she'd ever experienced in the village or living in the city with her 2 husbands. The men here wore buttoned-up shirts and pants ironed so well they seemed to stand erect despite the movement made by the men in them. The women's outfits, silk kaftans, glittering scarves and slips mimicked the colors of rainbows: red, yellow, orange, violet, blue, and purple. Gold earrings, necklaces, rings, and bangles made sounds that brought Timiro's attention directly to the jewelry. The women didn't walk into the room as much as they sashayed in. Each carried a plate of something in one hand and looped her other hand in her husband's bent elbow. It was indeed a sight to behold that some women had all that luck. Maybe she would have had some of that if it hadn't been her act of taking the cursed finger. Between envy and admiration, Timiro was mesmerized by the sight of these women, free to be happy. After serving pitchers of cold lemonade, the Habba took Timiro to her room and helped her change into a yellow kaftan with green olive leaves, creating crisscrossed lines on the bodice of the outfit. Her cousin handed her a black slip with gold beads at the hem and a green scarf. When dinner was announced a little after 7 that night, each woman brought forth her tray. In what seemed like 2 seconds, the table was covered with the most food Timiro had ever seen in one place. There was rice, beans, different kinds of bread, pasta mixed in with green vegetables made into salad, cookies, cakes, and cold sour camel milk in earthen jars. The aroma that wafted from the meats, goat, camel, and lamb, the Habba's contribution to the feast filled the room and made Timiro's mouth water. Each person, men and women, picked up a small plate and filled it with what they wanted. None of the women bothered to serve the men, and the men didn't seem to expect it. They followed no order when picking the food like people in her village. There, the men and children were served first. Women ate after everyone had their fill. Back home, The meal always started with the main dish, meat and rice. The sweets were never brought out until the meal was consumed and the dishes were cleared. After the meal, holding her mug of tea tight between her hands, Timur sat on one of the kitchen chairs away from her cousin and the guests. She was bewildered and fascinated by the ensemble before her. They gathered in small groups, some sitting on the cushioned chairs lined up on the back wall of the common room. Yet others remained standing, talking to each other in a loud, excited tone. Even though they came together as couples, the men and women, including the Haba and her husband, mingled indiscriminately and socialized with others. Their discussion ranged from politics to economy, but mainly about the havoc colonialism was wreaking in Somalia. The need for self-governance sat on every lip in that room, even though Timur didn't know what it meant then. From a distance, it was hard to see these were people with lives, families, and jobs. They appeared to have no care in the world, no families to care for, no children to raise, and no fields to harvest. Timur kept her distance for the subsequent 2 gatherings held in other homes. After the greetings and the meal, she sat alone and away from others, and they let her be as the watcher, and they didn't seem to mind being watched. Their parties, that's what they called them, occurred twice a month among a band of like-minded 10 couples and 3 single men. It was not until the 3rd time, 2 months later, that Timur decided to sit with 2 women and 1 man on an oversized couch. She walked over to them with no plan of what she intended to do once she got there. One of the women moved toward the men and pointed to a spot at the end. As Timur sat and listened, she realized the women in this group were their own people, which didn't bother the men. The group she sat with discussed an organization fighting for Somalia's independence from colonizers. Their passion overtook their conversations at times. Voices raised, pointing fingers and hand gestures ensued. From the distance, they appeared as if one person was ready to punch another. Words turned into shouting matches, but in the end, their discussion ended with handshakes and hugs. If Hassan had been there, he would have flown off the handle to see women behave like that. Over 170 miles from home, Timur began to enjoy this community of cheerful individuals. Among them, she was anonymous. No one asked her to take part in the debate. They didn't ask her questions to find out who the real Timur was and where she had come from. Perhaps they wouldn't have cared if they knew. Not that she was too eager to share the horror of her past. Still, she appreciated the comfort being new afforded her. Gone was the 28-year-old woman, divorced twice. She blended into the background without hinting that she had given birth to 3 children with nothing to show. She became one of them once they knew her name and her relation to Dahabo. And for that, she was eternally grateful. My Mother, The Person and the Patient can be found in Amazon Music, Apple Podcast, or wherever you get your podcasts. Please remember to follow, like, and share, and join me next week as I share with you another episode of my mother's journey as both the person and the patient. Thank you.